Hello, my name is Christian Kent, and this is my game analysis project for FMS 394 Video Games and Narrative. The game I'll be focusing on is Final Fantasy VII Remake. This game was released in 2020, and it is a remake of the original Final Fantasy VII released in 1997. Though it should be noted that this is more of a partial remake, as the game only covers the Midgar segment of the original. That is equivalent to about the first 30% of the original game. I do also want to state that I have never played the original, so my perspective is one of a newcomer to this story. The game was developed by Square Enix Business Division 1 and published by Square Enix. The plot of the story resembles a formula that we're all familiar with. I'm going to refer to it as the Star Wars formula, as the game is essentially about a group of rebels trying to take down an empire. For this project, I'm going to focus on how this game relates to the idea of agency, both in terms of gameplay and narrative themes. Starting with discussing the game design and elements, in terms of genre, this game is an action-adventure role-playing game. This game fits well into Scott Rogers' definition of these genres, as they rely on eye-hand coordination to play, and it focuses on characters, inventory, management, story, and puzzle solving for adventure. We'll go more into detail of these qualities into the next slide. This game has no multiplayer options. It is purely a single player experience. The game is played from a third person point of view. The player can see over the characters at all times. The game follows a progressive level design, with each level being labeled as a chapter. Each chapter focuses on a different subject matter and has a unique objective to solve. Each chapter follows a formula that usually culminates in a boss battle at the end, and there are about 18 chapters. Jesse Shell's idea of the string of pearls applies to this game design well. Uh, there are non-interactive cutscenes that provide exposition and information to the player in order to progress the story. This would be the string. Then the player is given control where they have free movement to complete the goal. This would be the pearl. And this is in terms of the gameplay. Continuing with gameplay, the player primarily controls the protagonist Cloud Strife. Although, during the combat, the player is able to switch between multiple characters in the party at real time. The real-time combat is a large deviation from the more retro turn-based combat of past Final Fantasy games. The player is able to attack the enemies by following the commands on the screen. The player has agency on how they wish to dispose of an enemy. For starters, if the player is fighting multiple enemies at a time, they may choose which enemy they wish to defeat first. It is up to the player to determine the best way to defeat an enemy. They can choose simple melee combat, they can choose to use magic, or a special ability. The player often has multiple characters in their party during a fight, and each character has unique strengths. For example, Barrett specializes in ranged combat, so the player can choose to select him during a fight to better defeat, say, a flying enemy, for example. Agency is also presented in this game through character customization. Though the player can't change the core design of the characters, they can choose to upgrade their weapons and abilities using the game's menu. These weapons are then visible in-game. The game follows a materia system. Materia in the game essentially gives special abilities to the characters. There is materia to give magic abilities during combat, such as fire and thunder, or there are materia that give you boosted stats during the game. The player has to constantly select which materia would work best for each character depending on context and strategy. The game is mostly linear, and most of the dialogue in the game is presented during cutscenes or while characters are, say, walking from one location to the next. There are the occasional dialogue options where the player can choose how rude or friendly they want to respond to something, but no matter what, the game still tends to play out exactly the same. Although the story is linear, the player does have some agency to partake in optional side quests. These side quests mainly take the form of helping civilians in the city with menial tasks. There are also optional optional boss fights that the player can partake in. While the player can avoid these altogether, they are rewarded for partaking in them either in the form of currency, new inventory, and new summons. Summons are powerful entities that can conjure during a difficult fight to assist you in combat. Final Fantasy VII Remake has a fairly linear narrative. Other than the optional side quests that a player can do, the story of the game is always going to play out exactly the same. In terms of narrative structure, the game follows Marcelo Arnaldo's Pacucci's idea of discovery narrative. Final Fantasy VII has many open world elements, though during certain missions the player will be forced to follow a set path. If they try to deviate from this path, they will encounter an inaccessible area notice. Though in between these missions, the player is encouraged to explore the map where they can find secret items and learn a bit more about the game's world through found information such as interacting with the civilian NPCs. And Pacucci describes discovery narratives as relying on players' free exploration of the game world to discover story information. And in this case, the player has complete agency to seek out this story information or not. As stated before, the game uses cutscenes in order to progress the narrative. The game also utilizes world building. The city of Midgar is vast and has many different unique areas that make it feel alive. There are quiet areas where families and the elderly live, shops and restaurants, as well as an exciting nightlife with clubs and partying. There are also certain rules of nature that apply to the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake. For example, in the world of Final Fantasy VII Remake, the planet has a spiritual energy called Mako, which is actually a large plot point of the game as the main villains are trying to drain the planet's Mako, and the heroes are trying to stop them. There are protagonists and antagonists, the main protagonists being Cloud and the members of Avalanche, as well as antagonists such as the Shinra organization and Sephiroth. The remake is a heavily character-driven game, and much of the game's run is directed to developing these characters. The player gets to spend time with each character and learn each of their individual personalities and character motivations. They also get to see these characters' point of views change as the story progresses because of their experiences. Let's discuss agency as a theme in the narrative. The game narrative features the Whispers of Fate, which are essentially ghosts that ensure that the events of the original Final Fantasy VII game happen as they did originally. It is the goal of Sephiroth to destroy these ghosts so that he has a chance to win since he lost in the original game. Once the ghosts are destroyed, which essentially leaves a message to the player that the following games will not necessarily follow the same path as the original one did. And in a sense, going forward, the characters in the game now have agency to change the story of the original. I selected this game specifically because of this subject matter of agency being woven into the narrative. Since Final Fantasy VII is so character-driven, I think that defines the player experience. Throughout the game, the player walks in the shoes of developed characters and essentially becomes these characters. The player feels like they have to multitask a lot during combat as they are constantly switching between characters and selecting different abilities to use. The player has a lot of control of the gameplay, especially during combat. The player really gets the sense of having to strategize here. Certain enemies are weak to certain attacks, so the player is always taking that into consideration when strategizing. The story does lack any meaningful choice, an idea discussed by Bryce Morrison. All four components of meaningful choice, awareness, gameplay consequences, reminder, and permanence, are absent throughout the game. Though there is agency as the player still has to play the game to progress the story. The development and time focused on the characters help to make them feel memorable, in addition to the very engaging combat and world. I would certainly recommend this game to any gamer. And here are my sources. Thank you so much.